This is the MC101 lecture for Chapter 3 in your textbook. Chapter 3 is about media economics, and one of the really important underlying principles of this early part of the course is to help you to understand how over the 500 or so year history of the mass media, one of the characteristics is that the media, the people who control these messages that come to us through the various media platforms, tend to be from rather large companies, at least national in scope in most instances, and in several, particularly in the recorded music industry, the scope of ownership is international. And in this chapter, one of the things that I'll try to help you understand is how when you have these very large media companies with a tremendous amount of influence with us as just regular people, consumers, but then also in business and industry, and certainly a significant amount of interest in the political sphere, then there's something that needs to be said about what's happening here, and something that we'll be exploring. So let's get started in Chapter 3. This is a chart that appears in your textbook, and you can look at the names of some of these companies. Some of them I suspect you'll be familiar with, others maybe not so much. But for instance, NBC Universal, NBC, the television network, Universal, the motion picture company, merged several years ago, and then in more recent times, they were purchased by the cable company Comcast. And look, $51.2 billion that this company, this combined company, made in revenue in a recent year. Disney, the company that now owns ABC and ESPN for that matter, is in second place at $38 billion. And yes, that is billion with a B. These are very large companies. I won't dwell on them. You can take a look. The chart is in your textbook, and I just wanted to create this general impression in your mind that when we talk about media companies, the influence that these really large corporations have on what we see, what we hear, what we read, and, well, I'll leave it up to you to decide, but does their influence extend to what we think? Let's go back in history to the time, just about the time when the United States are becoming the United States in the late 1700s. And this first bullet point that addresses government communication policy is important for one simple reason, and that is it's one of the only times, to my knowledge, in which our United States government has ever passed legislation, enacted laws, if you will, that affect the print media. Now, it's important to make this distinction. The print media are newspapers, books, and magazines. That's contrasted with the electronic media, which are radio, television, and later digital with satellite and the internet. But of course, these forms of electronic communication were 200 years away when the Postal Act of 1789 was passed. And simply, what's important to take away from this is the idea that, by and large, the government, the U.S. government, really asserts its complete independence of the way the print media operate. The print media are privately owned. The companies that publish the books and the newspapers and the magazines are all privately owned companies that purchase their own materials, the printing presses, the ink, the paper, the distribution system, and they, as private businesses, sell their products to us, the consumers, with very little, very, very little government intervention. So just understand, for purposes of our Chapter 3 discussion, that as far as the mass media is concerned, the government is pretty much absent when it comes to any discussion of the print media. So, We talk about the electronic media. I put a really important question in red here. Why are electronic media subject to a significant amount of government regulation when in fact the print media, as I just said, are not? Now let's think about this for just a moment. The newspaper industry operates relatively free and independent of any type of government intervention or government laws, and again, relatively free. The electronic media, however, the companies that own and operate the 18,000 radio stations in the United States, the 1,500 television stations in the United States, these owners are subject to quite a few federal regulations in the way that they operate. So why is this the case? Well, in order to understand that, we have to contrast the C in the SMCR model of communication. If you recall, just a few days ago in the lesson on Chapter 2, I said that we would be coming back and we would be discussing this subject later in our lessons. And so here again it reappears today. Sender sends a message through a channel to a receiver. In the model for the print media, the C represents the ink on paper. In the electronic mass media, the C represents the airspace that's around us. Remember, we discussed the idea that the airspace that surrounds us is not owned or controlled by any one individual person or any one individual company. Rather, it is owned, I guess, is probably the best word I can come up with, by we the people of the United States. And so to that extent, there's not a single one of us that can assert an individual right of ownership. All of us own it collectively. And so our government, dating back over 80 years ago, when I say our government, more specifically our Congress, our United States Senate and House of Representatives passed into law the Communications Act of 1934. And in that law, it created an entity called the Federal Communications Commission. We know it probably better as the FCC. And Congress charged this agency, this FCC, with the responsibility of administering access to the airwaves. And in doing so, Congress recognized that the airwaves belong to the public. They are a natural resource. Think perhaps about, as an analogy, think about our nation's highways, our state roads, our interstates, so forth and so on, are not owned by individual people, but rather by governments at various levels, county, state, and federal. And we're all free to use these roadways as long as we obey the rules of the road. Well, I'd like for you to think about that same situation when we talk about the FCC and the regulation of the airwaves. In the Communications Act that Congress passed in 1934, there's some language in that act that still today gathers a lot of attention, and it really helps to establish, to put into writing how the Congress established the relationship between the airwaves and the public. And the idea is this: much like all of us who drive cars and trucks, we are required by law to obtain a driver's license. That license is issued to us after we pass the test, and that license gives us the privilege of driving on the highways. Now, the key word there is privilege. Notice that I didn't say right. None of us has a right to have a license. It's a privilege that the government extends to us. And of course, I'm sure you know that if you violate the privilege, if you violate the rules of the road, there's the possibility that privilege could be taken away from you. Well, let me suggest that you apply that same kind of thinking to the FCC's relationship to broadcasters and the airwaves. Every broadcast station, radio, television, the owners of those stations are required to to receive a license from the federal government in order to operate. Now, with that license comes responsibilities. And the licensee, the individual or the company that operates the broadcast station, understands that for a period of 7 years, the government is giving that person or that corporation the right to use the public's airwaves to transmit their radio and TV signals to the general public. Okay, fair enough, but there's some conditions that Congress applies. And one of those main conditions is this idea, this concept, if you will, that in return for using publicly owned airwaves, broadcasters are required to operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. Broadcasters must serve the public interest, at the public's convenience, and at times of necessity. Whoa, pretty heavy stuff there. Yeah. Remember that broadcasters are using our airwaves. In return, our government expects something from broadcasters. Let me give you an example about the public interest and necessity. Look at the headline here from a couple of summers ago. A New York TV station interrupts its broadcast of the World Cup final to broadcast a severe weather update. Viewers flip out. Think about that for just a moment. One of the ways that broadcasters are expected to operate in the public interest is at times when the skies might turn dark and the winds begin to blow and the torrential rains begin to come down, and the National Weather Service issues, for instance, a severe thunderstorm warning or perhaps a tornado or hurricane warning. The Federal Communications Commission expects broadcasters to utilize their facilities to warn the public of imminent danger. When a tornado is bearing down on the community that you're in, and the local broadcasters don't interrupt their regular programming and tell you that it's time to take cover before the tornado strikes, well, how do you reckon in your mind that that's a way of serving the public interest? But interestingly enough, during this broadcast of the World Cup final, when the weather turned severe on this upstate New York TV station, look at the headline. The viewers went crazy. I guess they weren't concerned about the weather so much, but they certainly were concerned about the outcome of the soccer match. Well, these kind of situations don't rear their ugly heads all that often, but I use this as an example just to help you to better understand the idea that that the broadcasters are using publicly owned property to conduct their business, and as such, our government holds them to the responsibility of serving our interest. And remember now, we contrast that over in the print media, which has no sort of parallel government regulation, because the companies that own and operate the newspapers are not using public property. A while ago, we mentioned, all the printing presses, the ink they use, the paper they put the ink on, the delivery system, all of that's privately owned property. And so as a result of that, our government doesn't have the obligation, doesn't have the legal requirement to intervene. Now, on this page, up in the left-hand corner, you see the scarcity model, the trusteeship model. In essence, that's what I have been describing to you for the past 5 minutes or so. It's called the scarcity model of regulation because there's simply not enough room in the airspace for every person or every company that would like to own and operate a broadcasting station, both radio and television, to do so. We simply reach a saturation point where only so many individual electronic signals can travel through a given airspace without colliding and interfering with one another and creating interference. For instance, you wouldn't want to turn on the TV and find on one particular channel that there are three different TV stations trying to broadcast their picture and sound to you. That wouldn't be serving anybody's interest. And so, because there are only a limited number of spaces available in the airwaves, the government has to determine through the licensing process who is eligible to hold the license and who is not, who doesn't get the license and thus doesn't have the opportunity to operate the broadcast station. Well, because the number of licenses is scarce as a result of that limitation in the amount of airspace, then the term, the scarcity model, developed as a way of describing this approach to broadcast regulation. So, under this system of government licensing that began with the Federal Radio Act in 1927 and then was re-energized 7 years later in 1934 with the Communications Act, our government set limits on how many broadcasting stations an individual person or company could own, and it imposed quite a few technical restrictions that would limit the distance in which broadcast stations would operate, and would also lay out many more important technical restrictions to make sure that broadcasters' signals were not electrically interfering with one another and making it difficult for us to receive the programming. Now, there's another way of looking at the need for broadcast regulation that's indicated on the right. It's called the marketplace model. It is a capitalistic approach. In other words, if we boil it down to its essence, it's saying that out in the market itself, that broadcasters, as the owners and operators of businesses that are attempting to make a profit, that broadcasters will conduct themselves in ways that will be consistent with the public interest, because if you do something that runs counter to the public interest, then they're not going to be watching your TV station or listening to your radio station, and your profits are going to suffer as a result of that. So just understand that there are two different ways of thinking about why the electronic media should be regulated. One says, yes, they should be regulated. The other group would say, no, it's not necessary for the government to intervene, because out in the marketplace, just operating as businesses with a profit motive will be sufficient to make certain that broadcasters continue to serve public interest. Well, neither one is right, neither one is wrong. I present the two of them to you for consideration, and I'll let you make up your mind. There are 3 videos that I have posted on the Moodle course homepage that relate to Chapter 3. One of them has to do with the future of newspapers, and we will spend about 10 minutes with the publisher of the newspaper, the Los Angeles Times. Los Angeles is the second largest city in the United States, and the LA Times is a very widely respected newspaper, not only in LA, and not only in the United States, but around the world. So I'm going to ask you to watch this video, and it will give you some information about what the future of newspapering is here in the United States. Your textbook also has a page devoted to the biography of Rupert Murdoch. He is the Australian multi-billionaire who is thoroughly entrenched in mass media in the United States. I won't dwell on that. The media will tell you more about who Rupert Murdoch is and the media properties he owns. And then the third video, and this is a longer video. It's an hour and a half long. It's a documentary made by the filmmaker Ken Burns. He is widely respected for the documentaries that he has produced in the last 25 years or so. Empire of the Air is the story of 3 men who were behind-the-scenes developers of radio broadcasting. And this video will examine several of the economic situations that led to the development of wireless transmission, which we know as radio broadcasting, and then even later television broadcasting. I hope you enjoy this. It's a really interesting documentary. After you watch, I've published a little 9-question matching quiz in which you'll match characteristics of the 3 men who are profiled in this documentary. And that will help to test your knowledge of the information. 3 men, by the way, I think you'll find them very interesting. One was an absolute business genius. The other, the second, an absolute technical wizard. And the third, well, I don't know. He purports to be a genius. He purports to be the father of radio. But some people think he's crazy. I'll let you decide on that.